Hey everyone, welcome back to Studio Bridge Artist Podcast. I'm your host, Raymond Bonilla, and uh, I am so delighted to welcome my new guest on this episode, Martin Wittfooth. Martin, thanks so much for having us, man.
Yeah, hey, thanks for inviting me. This is fun. Thank you.
Dude, I've been a long time fan of your work, and I just followed you kind of throughout the years, and you're one of those painters that had an illustration background and then kind of went into the gallery world, and just like myself, and I've always found that really interesting because you don't normally get that, or at least when like back in the day. I mean, you and I are pretty close in age. I know you were like kind of born in '81, right?
Yep.
And so I was born in '83, and so um, I always track that like idea of like, oh, I went into illustration thinking like this is what I wanted to do, and then I discovered this whole other world, and I was like, whoa, what about this thing, And so I've always appreciated kind of your insights on things. I guess the my first question was, can you tell us about a little bit about your background in terms of like kind of where you came from and what your schooling was like and so on and so forth?
Sure. Yeah. So I was born in Canada, in Toronto, and then when I was very little, I think a year and a half or something like that, my whole family's from Finland and Sweden. So my family moved back to Finland, and I was there for, let's say, 11 or 12 years. So my childhood was spent there. Um, and I'm not sure really, I can't really track exactly if being in Northern Europe had an influence on sort of my interest in the kind of image making that then resulted later. Um, but I feel like living in Finland, I was growing up. But do you know the illustrator John Bauer? He's a German
Hmm.
illustrator. Made these just beautiful illustrations, kind of in the school of almost like Arthur Rackham,
Yeah.
in that kind of time period. And I feel like maybe my exposure to stories like that, of that kind of region as well, kind of stayed with me to whatever degree. And then uh, when I went to high school up in northern Toronto, there's a northern secondary school is where I went, and they actually had an illustration class and a life drawing class. Like they had a pretty comprehensive art program for just being a regular high school. And
Wow.
I remember those subjects being ones that I was immediately attracted to. I just really wanted to kind of focus most of my efforts as far as my education went toward that. There was just something there that was pulling at me, and via that, so the illustration instructor I had, he put it in my head that hey, maybe I want to pursue illustration in college. So there's the college called Sheridan Institute now. It was called Sheridan College back then, just outside of Toronto in the sort of suburban area around it. And they have a very strong animation program and illustration program. And the animation program back then, this was 99 is when I graduated high school. So there was still a big lean toward 2D animation. So
Right.
Sheridan would produce a lot of like Disney animators and stuff like that in the animation program, but the illustration program was really attractive as well. So I was sitting there kind of thinking like, which way do I want to go? Is it toward animation, toward illustration? But I went the illustration route primarily just for wanting to, first of all, learn how to make images, but also the idea of sort of visual storytelling, like representational ways by which I could create images. But I wanted to go learn how to actually do all of it, right? Starting from just even learning how to use any mediums that we could be practicing. But beyond that too, is just felt like, okay, this could be a way by which I could maybe try and learn to become an artist that can also potentially make money at it, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so there was that attractor as well, but it was just so like early on in my thinking of just art in general that it just seemed like a good landing spot. So I went into that program, and while I was there, so it was just they had us doing all types of different assignments in all types of different media, but I didn't land on oil paint really until the very end. My last year there, um, I just started to really want to see what it could do within, specifically within oil paint. But I remember it being a very like, just for whatever subconscious reason, even it was such an intimidating medium, because so many masterworks have been done in it that I was just thinking. I remember in college thinking like, there's no way I can handle that medium. I should probably stick to things like acrylics or whatever. For whatever reason, it
Right.
just seemed like that's more approachable. But once I started to just dabble in oils, it just became like the main attractor for me. So, they're clumsy paintings. They're stylized in the way that I was trying to find my sort of illustration voice back then. But I still like looking back at them, just like I like to look back at works from any previous era of my development, just to see like what is it that I started to learn at this phase or that. So as far as applying myself then to illustration assignments, that became a thing that was a little bit more vague, only because right around 99 2000, the illustration field was starting to move a bit more toward mediums such as digital, right? Like there was a lot more emphasis on quicker turnarounds, stuff like that. But this was still the age also of illustrators like Dan Adele, a number of illustrators that were working in paint, right? But I think it was maybe, what was it, a year or two after college, during which I was just working in an art store, trying to get illustration gigs, and I got some. I did an album cover for this band called Silverstein back then. I ended up doing a bunch of snowboard illustrations, because these were also like that whole idea of even making work for snowboards was very much in keeping with what I was already doing. I was snowboarding a bunch through high school and stuff, so it just it seemed like that was going to be my track. That's going to be my main employer, is this type of illustration work. But it was a couple of years after college that I started to see, especially on the West Coast, galleries. Well, there were really just a couple of galleries that were starting to show illustrators or illustrators turned painters. So an example of that would be La Luz de Jesus Gallery, run by Billy Shire. He put up shows for instance, Mark Ryden, Eric White was in there as well, who then ended up becoming my MFA thesis advisor once I went to New York. So there's something there that I started to notice that I would like to see what could happen if I just apply myself in that direction. So again, I think it was 2, maybe 3 years after college, I saw that there was a big group show came up at La Luz de Jesus that you could submit to, and if you got in, you'd be sharing the wall space with about 100 other artists, or at least 100 other pieces of artwork. And this was back in the day when you wouldn't email them. I literally sent them slides. Like that's how old I feel now, right? And I sent.
They're expensive. They were expensive to put together, and pain in the ass too.
Yeah, and it was a whole production, because first you have to, document the work well, but then turn them into slides and then package them properly, send them out. So, having gone through all that though, from my first submissions, which they were ridiculous paintings, like looking back at them, like they have no relationship at all to what I'm doing now. But I ended up getting them in. I got 2 pieces in the first time I submitted. And if I recall correctly, like one of them sold, which then just, all it did was just encourage me to think like, hey, I could maybe do this. Or like, maybe I could, but it was still so vague. And in the meantime too, up in Canada, I was living up in Ottawa at the time. I had my first show with a friend of mine in an art store. We ended up just putting together a collection and developed that I had also sent out to LA. And then the next year, I submitted again to the same show, and this time it was still in the same style of what I had done, but I had become more and more kind of influenced by painters that I was looking at more closely as to how they're actually handling the medium. I was getting rid of some of the more awkward sort of stylizations while still the work was still immature. But that said, that time when I sent the work out, I think both of the pieces, I think I had two of them in there. They both sold, and then Billy Shire offered me a more of a feature show. It was a 4-person show. So that's when I remember that being kind of the catalytic moment of thinking like, hey, this might actually work out. But I just started applying all of myself just to starting to develop this body of work that would then become my first sort of feature show out there. But what you touched on there before, and it's important here, is that it wouldn't have happened had there not been galleries that were championing illustrators or like an illustrative style, right? This hadn't happened at all on the East Coast yet. I mean, there's even a reason why the kind of movement that arose from the galleries on the West Coast being called lowbrow. I think Robert Williams coined it, which was basically like a middle finger thrown against the art establishment that was kind of had put up a firewall between even representational art in a grander sense. So the fact that I had these kind of champions on the West Coast to give me wall space was the reason I was able to then actually pursue this as something feasible. And then right after that 4-person show, I ended up going to New York to attend SVA for my master's. But even for my master's, instead of going in a painting program, I went to the illustration as visual essays, what it's called, an MFA.
Yeah.
Run by the late great Marshall Ayersman.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was fundamental in me now for a few reasons, but two of the main ones were it was a 2-year kind of bubble I could form around myself to really just try and figure this stuff out. And it put me in sort of the cauldron of intimidation. I loved going to New York for the reason that on everywhere around me were people doing stuff that I aspired to do myself, but I had no idea yet how to do it at that level. So just being in New York was a humongous influence on just pushing me to a place that I just had no understanding of getting to prior to that, right? Just even getting around people, like my thesis advisor, as I said, was Eric White for the second year. In the second year, it's very self-directed. You're working on whatever project you want to, but I made my project, my thesis, so to speak, was my first solo show at Copper Gallery. Back then it was called Copper Nason Gallery. And it was founded by Greg Escalante and Gary Pressman was the director there. So they gave me my first shot at like a full show, and I dedicated that entire second year under Eric's advisory sort of influence to just really put together a show that I could feel pretty proud about. And as luck would have it, it went really well. It was like a good first entry into having like a full feature show. As I recall, I think it was like my very first show. Also, my prices were at a point where I think they were really approachable. But if I recall correctly, it was a sold out show. So just like really like
awesome,
set me on a path to now also feel like, hey, I don't have to sort of have a secondary gig to really pull this off. It was still meager living. I mean, New York rent and all that, but it was an interesting thing to notice that I could, for the first time ever, like actually do this full time and pay my bills with it.
Right.
And
Right.
also when I was at the MFA there too, there was a lot of the other students in the program were moving toward digital mediums and things of that nature that set them up really well to do illustration gigs. Whereas me being focused on oil painting, it almost became just a secondary aspect to it, that I would even try and pursue illustration jobs. So it just became clear at that point that I should probably just stay the course and go toward like the gallery, personal works kind of field. But and as of then, it was just from that one first show. And this is something I advise my students about often, is that rather than trying to figure it out in too complicated a fashion of like how might you get discovered, it can very well be that it could be you put all your focus in on one project, say a single show, and if the show is exposed well enough, other galleries will notice. At least that was my experience with it, right? Yeah. So from that first solo show, then other shows started to come about, but in that same genre, right? The next show I had after that was at Rock LaRue Gallery in Seattle in 2010. And then around that time too, I submitted my work to New American Paintings, and I got one of the paintings that I sent in ended up on the cover of that. And that too, all of a sudden, just having it on the cover of that reached a ton more people that I ended up working with. So as of then, it's just been show after show. A lot of group shows back then too. I was just sending my work everywhere. And in the intervening years, it's become a little bit more concentrated, where I'll give myself plenty of time to do a full solo show, at least a year and a half. But there was a time there where I'd take even 2 solo shows in a year, and I was completely just immersed in the work. I was putting in like 12, 14-hour days. I have 2 kids now, so that's not my modus operandi anymore. I have a very boring schedule. It's like 9 to 5, Monday to Friday kind of a thing. But it didn't used to be that way. It used to be I'd be painting sometimes till like 4 or 5 in the morning, get up at 8 and get back to it again. It was, not something I could sustain for long, but I'm glad I really put in the hours back then. Just to develop my visual language, because that's not something that, again, with students in mind, sometimes there's an emphasis, especially in when I think back at the BFA that I did in the illustration program, there's this big emphasis on, spend this time at school, but by the end of the years you're there, you should really have like a unique style locked down. And I've come to realize in the meantime that like it's such a slow process for that to actually emerge. At least for me, it was. Right. So it's just working a lot, doing a ton of paintings, and each of them kind of inform the next one, especially series too. If I'm doing a series of work, that just working on a series, all of the pieces are informing each other, but it's also informing what I should maybe think of doing the next time around, and onwards, and there's no real end to it. I think it was Vincent Desiderio. I was doing a mentorship program alongside him in Spain last October. I remember he had a really interesting thing that he brought up that I hadn't really thought about, but I thought it was really, like, it just stuck. He was talking about how painting is a kind of human endeavor that doesn't evolve in a linear fashion toward an endpoint, right? Like, there isn't a trajectory of like painting is supposed to reach somewhere, because it never will. It's always just constantly, it's evolving horizontally rather than vertically, right? There are other things like, just as an example, like, if we want to set our sights as a species to get to Mars, for instance, right? Well, there's a linear evolution as to how we achieve that, right? There could be various ways we can probably come up with how we do it, but that's a linear evolution. Whereas painting is more horizontal, almost like a living, growing thing. It's grown off of the roots of what's beneath it, but it's constantly just grown outward with no boundaries around it. So when I'm thinking just subjectively on my own work as well, that's now that I have enough time and enough work behind me to look at, it's constantly doing the same thing. It's just, I was so hung up on it needing to be solved when I was, say, in my early 20s. And now I've learned like that was bullshit, you know, like it just, that's not at all how I actually evolved as a painter. It was just a matter of putting in the work and letting it, the process take its own course. Yeah, so that's pretty much the summary of it, how I ended up where I am now, I guess. There's a
Right.
lot
Well, I
in
think
between.
well, interesting you talk about your training in the early days, because I think as I remember when I was a student back in those days, everything was so overwhelming that craved a linear path. Right?
Mm.
Isn't it funny? It's like, oh, if I could just learn how to do X, Y, X, I'll be fine.
Yeah, right.
And then
Yeah.
it's like, okay, learn techniques in oil paints, and then I'll become an oil painter, and everything will be all right in the world.
Yeah,
Uh,
right. Yep.
and like, meanwhile, it's like, or okay, if I learn anatomy, or if I learn how to paint, the figure photorealistically, or and then it's like it keeps leapfrogging, and then eventually, I was just thinking the other day, I was working on a painting. I'm like, it's like I could care less about the drawing in this place, and there was
Yeah.
nothing. Like, if I was just thinking about to myself, oh my god, if the 20-year-old version of me heard me talking about my paintings like this,
Yeah.
it'd be like infuriated. It's like they think I've lost it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
But I obviously there's some real value, like really true good advice to be found in also just having focus, right? Because if I think back
right.
at my earlier self, like way back, where I didn't quite know at all which direction to take, even with the medium itself. So just landing on trying to just take apart, say, oil paint, and like really start to understand what I can do within that sphere, right? Had I still been kind of or aiming at being like a jack of all trades, I would have always just been lost in there. So I like that there's still
Yeah.
like moments when you focus in on something, like in when I was in New York in the SVA program, I ended up taking a portrait painting course that, just from the thing I read in the catalog about it, because I audited it as an extra course that I could just take separately from the main program. And
Hmm.
from the reading, like the little blurb about it, I'm like, well, this sounds like something that would be of value to me, but I'm not sure yet. And when I got in there, I realized like, oh, this is learning with somebody who is very hung up on knowing how paintings were made in a previous time, with proper
Right.
underpaintings, how to glaze, what mediums to use and when, and all that kind of stuff. Plus setting up something to look at that isn't getting you too cerebrally confused about how much this should mean. It was just a portrait painting course. Like, I'm
Hmm.
painting portraits of people I don't know, right? And I remember that was so important that I had access to that, because that just started getting me much more comfortable with the techniques and the medium. And then from there, I could start to then try and weave in a kind of personal narrative into the work. Um,
Right.
so that structure was so important, that it was so laser focused on this one area. But then from gaining what I needed to gain from it, that's when I could start to expand from it again. Um, yeah, but that said, like, I always hesitant to ever end up somewhere where now I feel like I've totally figured something out, and now I'm just staying within that. I always want to try and keep expanding it, but at least I have some kind of solid basis from which to expand, right?
Right.
So
Right.
20-year-old me should have heard that too, and eventually did in my mid 20s, right? But when I was floundering early on, it was just, man, my first portfolio that I sent out, I remember sending them out to these snowboard clients that then I ended up getting. The kind of jobs I got from them were so just scattered because the portfolio I sent them was so scattered. I had like line drawings in there. I had acrylic paintings. I had like children's book illustrations. It was just all over the place.
Yeah.
The first jobs I got, they had me doing like Frank Frazetta style, like barbarian paintings. Then they had me do little kittens for children's boards and stuff. And I'm really happy that those things happen. But I remember thinking back then, like, what am I actually doing? Like, what is my style? And I'm glad I didn't actually have one back then at all. But eventually it
Yeah,
became more
that's
clear, right?
well, I think that the whole style thing is really interesting. I was always hung up on it in undergrad because I wanted to be successful. I wanted to make this whole thing work. But I remember coming across Education of an Illustrator by written by Marshall and Stephen Heller, and there was like a blurb. I think it might have been Brad Holland who had written something, and he had said like, you know, in 4 years, remember, basically to the extent of like 4 years, you're not going to be able to come up with some sort of unique style. Like, remember, I couldn't do that, so don't worry about it. And I was like,
Yeah,
it was just this like little thing
yeah,
that I was just sort of reading, and it was just so relaxed. But you kind of have to go through that almost like artistically schizophrenic journey, because you just don't know until you actually do. It's such a physical uh, action that you have to go through,
yeah,
that you there's no way to really shortchange that, because there's always like, oh, what if I did this, or what if I did that? Because I remember always thinking every week I wanted to be a different artist. It was like,
right.
and sometimes every day I'd be looking through like images that I'd save for inspiration. I'm like, oh, no, 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 I want to do this. Like I remember Frank Stockton's uh work when he just came out. It was this linear, just beautifully drawn, and it was like, oh yeah, that's the stuff I want to do. And then
Yeah,
I'd see
right.
Greg Manchus, and I was like, no, 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 I want to do that. I want to be an oil painter. And then just like, this is like a mess. But you're touching on that is really, really important. Like in school they tell you like, well, no, you have to have a cohesive portfolio, and there's a good reason for it, because otherwise you'll get like random jobs. But at the same time, that randomness is very helpful, because it's like you got the ability to actually say like, okay, do I like doing this stuff, or
Sure,
like, or seeing
sure.
instant feedback as to like, oh, like the decisions that you made or how you present yourself that directly impacts the type of work that you're getting. And
Yeah, yeah,
uh and it's I could totally see how that kind of got, forced you to kind of have a unique, or just investigate what it is that you want to do.
yeah,
And I find that it's awesome that you, at the same time, galleries in the West Coast were starting to open up to, more illustrative styles, like you were saying, like Mark Ryden. And I remember Jeff Soto's pieces. And like, I studied out in the West Coast in San Francisco, and so there was two galleries called White Walls and the Shooting Gallery.
yeah,
And yeah, I mean, I saw like Sean Barber's first show there, Kim Kogan's, um, you know, people like Wes Burt and Cora Kaufman painting. And I was thinking like, I didn't even, it was like what Marshall Arison was talking about in his book, in the flesh. It was like, wow, these are people with personal voices that are just saying like, hey, this is an outlet for my work. It wasn't
yeah.
like, so caught up on being identifying themselves with a singular job role,
Sure, yeah,
which was, you had to draw that line back in the day. But I could see it just sort of dissolving, and it's quite an interesting time to kind of see that, um, then moving itself all the way back to the East Coast, where like before then you just did not have that. You had like, contemporary art, and then you had very classical, atelier, a really small set of galleries that were sort of catering to those types of collectors.
yeah. And at the same time,
So
too, you had like street art became something that moved from the
right,
little streets into gallery spaces, but
yeah,
again, by the championing of the same the same kind of core group of galleries that were saying like, yeah, this barrier that's existing, let's start to bridge it more, just by really recognizing like this art is also needing to be seen, right? Like this
Right.
work is also needing its moment in the spotlight. Not to say like the street art's nature is generally one in which it is seen in the spaces we occupy, right? But the fact that that the galleries were starting to give it, the kind of attention that I think it warranted. Because again, the blue chip galleries and stuff are like, hell no, we're not touching this. And then
Right.
I feel like, I could be wrong here on the timeline, but I feel like, for instance, something like Jonathan Labine putting Shepard Fairey in his gallery, and then next up,
Right.
he's with Jeffrey Deitch, and he
Right.
like blew up, right?
Yeah.
And
It's crazy to think that, like, because he had a solo show at the shooting gallery, and I
yep,
remember seeing his stuff up, and I'm thinking like, oh my God, this is unbelievable. And it was at that point that I thought like, oh, this is the generation that like grew up influenced by all of those things,
yep,
and now have the ability to now get into the art world,
yep,
and like this is what's happening here, and uh it's crazy to think that he was, I mean, like I remember he had left like that day of the show. Earlier that day, they were throwing up a piece of graffiti in San Francisco and almost
yep,
got caught by the cops. And I
yeah,
was like, oh, this was then he was like going to his solo show,
yeah,
where
yeah,
people
yeah,
were paying $20 a print. I remember this. It
yeah,
was like, to think that this is even like a reality, and then he, where he is now, it's just nuts.
yeah,
To
yeah.
think about. So yeah, you're definitely. I think your read on it is what I experienced, at least,
Yeah, yeah, and
during
it's
that time.
by now though, the whole gallery world, it there is a large influx now of representational work throughout, like all the way from
Hmm.
all the levels of the gallery world. But I'm I have a feeling that that couldn't have happened had it not been for, again, for a few sort of just like catalytic starters to that even being possible. And I would
Right.
put that very much on the, yeah, like the West Coast galleries that were like, all right, cool, you guys are doing that thing over there. We're gonna just champion stuff that people do want to see and people want to acquire. People want this stuff. And now, you could go to Chelsea, you can go to blue chip galleries, and that type of work is now on display again. And representational art in a big sense. I feel like it was maybe the aughts, like in the 2000s, that doors started to open for more and more people
Hmm.
to explore that. And now it's alive and well. So that the bridge there used to be kind of vague as to how to bridge it. Now it's
Right.
universal. So
Yeah.
it's a cool
I
time
think
to
the
be.
internet helped. I
Yeah.
think the internet helped a lot about, with that too. I mean, just the forums, and I mean, do you remember conceptart.org?
Yep.
Yeah, and like being able to go on there and just see all these artists, Marco Georgievich, and like hanging out with like uh people like William Whitaker. Do you remember William Whitaker's
Yeah. Yeah.
work? He was like
Yeah.
yeah, and like he was just hanging out and doing demos for people and
Yeah.
posting them, and like these people were doing stuff for Marvel, and then like going off like, it's like I was thinking like there's no way, like if we didn't have the internet or an ability to do this, like William Whitaker would have just stayed in Utah, maybe been able to travel and do workshops in person, but like that's about it, and like you had
Yep.
to go get, I remember going to the library at the Academy of Art University where I studied, where I did my grad work, and just searching for any American artist with like a step-by-step breakdown of like some painter
Yeah. Right.
that was doing, looking at old like VHS tapes of, Bert Silverman painting, and
Yeah.
just,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, it was the scan lines, going through, and I'm just like taking notes, and like, now we have this, which is which is nuts, and that like influence, nowadays it's like representationalism. Like you're right. I mean, it happened really fast. It didn't really. I felt like that's type of stuff took longer in the past, but
Yep.
it's so just one day, everyone's just showing figurative art, whereas like when I was in school, it was almost shunned upon if you weren't an illustrator.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, totally. Well,
you know,
it really there was a clear line dividing those two vocations, so to speak.
yeah,
But it's interesting to have been there, and like really like not just observed it, but actually been part of when that line started getting more and more blurry. And it was right at
hmm
the advent also of the internet. Again, just
right,
before it like really became a household thing, late 90s. I mean, yes, there was internet, but it wasn't like, again, I had to send slides to to submit with. Well, I wanted to ask you actually, since we're on the topic of the should we say evolution or just like the influence of especially the social media era on art. But what are your thoughts on what's happening, especially in the illustration sphere, which I have enough friends still in that I can get a gauge on like what they're up to as far as illustration work goes. But what's your feel on what AI is doing as far as just also in a very strange way, like contributing a massive amount of new images that kind of bleed into the mix of
yeah,
what people are doing haptically, like with analog materials or doing digital artwork by hand, because it's starting to get very strange from
yeah,
my vantage point. It's not, to my mind, it's not ever gonna upend, you know, painters because there's still so much about painting that, you know, at least to my mind, you have to observe them and interact with them in person. But because
right,
mostly all at least previews of what the work is, we're going to see digitally. And now you're just getting AI going right into the mix. And if it's being reproduced, say uh, for an illustration type of scenario, right? It's being just reproduced in some media where it's, you know, going to be printed, or most often
right.
now it's going to be online. What are your, if you have any thoughts about it, what are your thoughts about what's going
Y-
on there?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I there's a paraphrase. John English. He always I would always hear him say like the illustration uh, has always been linked to the Industrial Revolution. It was
Mm-hmm.
made possible because things were, the printing press came out and you could, print massive amounts, and mail came around and you could, uh, you know, uh, uh, gain so many audiences that were so much wider than where you lived. And then that just kept evolving. And it's always kind of that game that of evolution that illustration kind of plays with it. My views on it is like I think the technology is absolutely stunning. I think the on the at the base level, how it's been able to evolve so quickly is unfortunately like dubious. It's based off of training data that people didn't have consent to use in a lot of cases, and that's where the sort of the legality is. But I'm a huge tech head, so I think like the ability that it gives artists is really incredible. But right now we're seeing such this crazy bubble um, form over this thing that you're seeing all these different types of applications and promises for you know all of these things. But I think that we're still in this time of flux that we're not going to understand it. Like in about 5 years, we'll probably. I'm always saying like the dust will settle like a little bit more, and we can kind of see what's going on. But I think illustration's gonna change. It always has changed, and
Yeah.
it's just about kind of evolving for it. Markets change, the money always moves to different places. I mean, to think about the fact that like NC Wyeth was getting paid like $5,000 in illustration for Treasure Island, and he just built a house and bought all this property with one book.
Yeah, sure.
I mean,
Yeah,
that's crazy, right? And
yeah,
and the fact that that uh he died, him and Howard Pyle, they both died frustrated because they thought the illustration was dead, or what they knew as illustration had been kind of eroded. Um, and it was because the magazines figured out that they were making more money from advertisers than subscribers. And so all of the taste, and the way they branded their books or in their magazines was to get more advertisers. And so, that's when like Linedecker and all those guys came out. And then,
yeah,
and more decorative, more design based, and, narratives based off of not fantasy, but rather romance and things that were more relatable to housewives who were like the number one sort of readers. And, it's, so I don't know what's going to happen, to the industry. It is already changing. You're seeing it left and right. But I think also just like the use of AI will vary based off of the voice of the artist too. I don't think that's
sure.
ever going to change.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
because it's you see it with like well, it's not like the same as the advent of Photoshop and digital art, but we could use that example as kind of like a way of seeing how it might evolve, in the sense that when digital art came out, a lot of things that were uh, possible or achievable only by lots of training or specialized training were all of a sudden just gone.
yeah,
They were done. They were deemed like not usable or just irrelevant, like airbrushing and things like that, getting smooth transitions, like the fact that you could do that with the click of a button in Photoshop. You just erase like, people years off people's lives, right, that they
yeah,
had
yeah,
spent just like getting the dexterity to do that. But at the end of the day, like everyone it was like oh yeah, digital, digital, digital. But like you look back on it now and you're like, oh my God, all the stuff looked the same because everyone was just taking the short route and just
yeah,
saying like, just making something that looks spectacular for their time. But, at the end of the day, never had any longevity because there was nothing else behind it. And I think that, at least I'm seeing that with AI imagery now, like you can kind of tell, and a very noisy image with a lot of information, with no real storytelling or no real voice behind it, is going to remain a superficial image. So it'll just sort of be passed on by. So that's always been my opinion of the whole thing. It's we'll see. We'll see. I
yeah,
mean, what are
yeah.
what are your thoughts? I mean, because I think it's going to change. It's changing practices for sure. Like how we make
Sure.
art is
Yeah,
going to change, and I think the technology is really cool. Like to
yeah,
be able to, but I mean, like you're into 3D. You've always been into like the digital, using digital to help you visualize your pieces. Um, at the end of the day, it's really fun to work with those tools, but it's not like, the message of your piece is going to be the message of your piece. But and
yeah,
I guess that's us as painters is is a unique view in that sense. It's like we're dealing with, I mean, the stuff, our mediums that we're dealing with is like was state of the art for like what, the 14th, 15th century,
sure.
so like we're already antiquated, right? So it's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
like, we
yeah,
know that it's like, it's not the medium itself, it's just like what you're saying with it,
yeah.
in many regards.
Yeah,
But
I echo those sentiments completely. So yeah, when I'm thinking on the AI thing, it's just that it's because of, you know, I'm also interested in what's happening like technologically as far as certain tools coming about, or certain tools becoming more and more complex, and how we can weave that into our own visual language, right? So to me, the conversation between artists and technology has always been a dialogue. It's always been there from the very beginning of time, but you see it even in this may sound like superficial, but even like at a certain time, certain pigments weren't even available for artists to use. Hence, we don't see those
Right.
colors appearing in that work, right? Then you get to
Right.
say the pre-Raphaelites, you start seeing more and more of these kind of poppy purples that just weren't present before that. So that's a technology that comes about, and it's not that the artists are discovering them, they're just starting to incorporate those kind of technologies, if you want to call them that, into their workflow. And in the same way, because I have this conversation going on all the time, because I have students that are signing up to study 3D sculpting and 3D modeling with me, and all the other stuff we can do in there, such as texturing them and lighting them in whatever way. And there too, you know, the question from more of a puritanical source could be like, well, is this cheapening the process of coming up with images? But then I'm sure the same question may have then been posed to, say, Rubens when he's setting up dioramas to paint from, right? It's
Right.
just tools that, say, Rubens was alive today, he would have his factory or whatever, like his army of assistants creating these things digitally, right? Still arriving at the image that the artist has that they want to materialize into a painting or a sculpture or whatever it happens to be. That's like the ways by which we get to that image coming into the world, the tools by which we can make that achievable. I think that's something that artists that are still going to be stuck, because there's going to be a lot of, say, like atelier artists that will just feel like there's some kind of spiritual whatever, like maybe even a betrayal of some kind of hidden code if they go toward that. I think that's totally valid for people to feel that if they do, but I feel like a lot of people might shortchange themselves to also just ignore what is possible by virtue of having these things at our disposal. But that said, I mean, there's still like, so say with me teaching a Blender course and using that, but I'm also using ZBrush, a program called Substance Painter to paint textures onto my models. Those things, you still have to apply yourself to them, right? There's nothing automated. You can use procedural effects, meaning you can use things in a way that you don't have to do every little minute part of it by hand, but it's still within your control as to how that manifests itself. Whereas with AI, there too, honestly, I feel like it's got to start becoming a conversation that artists are having with what that is. Because I feel like with AI, we're kind of at the Pong or Atari stage of what this is.
Yeah.
We're seeing it now, like it's very impressive and weird what it's doing. I have no clue what it's actually doing when you're generating an image from a text prompt, say. But I have a suspicion that give it 10 years from now, or as we said, in like 5 years, things are going to look way different. And what that even then implies, or what implications it may have, say, for what's going to happen as maybe it even starts to translate into virtual reality spaces or whatever it is. It's going to just expand. I mean, it's going to become more and more of a force to be reckoned with. But I wonder if maybe in that being the case, I wonder if this is going to potentially push more aspiring, say, illustrators to start to go toward haptic analog painting, almost in the way of like, that is a way by which we can still, inside of painting, say, we can still dialogue with the thing, but a blank canvas can't just be generated for you. You still have to be involved with it and intentionally, with human deliberation, bring it to life, right? So I just wonder what that is going to mean, as far as maybe this means more and more artists are going to be born out of this time, but maybe the way by which these artists start to express themselves is going to start going more and more towards our analog mediums. It could be something as similar as it wasn't that long ago, but the whole like hipster movement toward like everything being artisanal and like farm to table and like all that. Like maybe that there's something there
Right.
that like, because I think the human spirit will still have us wanting to, regardless of what the times are doing technologically, because also just social media as a force, I think is causing a lot of just psychological issues for a lot of people. I see it in
Yeah.
myself too. It's just like getting so wrapped up in a second life happening on a little screen, and like it's just weird. So I feel like the resistance to that, it's still very much now part of our lives in a very true, intimate sense. But yeah, I wonder if with the advent of AI, if there isn't a similar kind of sense of knowing that it's there, seeing what it can do to potentially um, aid us as artists, however it can, but still having the will as humans to not entirely live in this technologically mediated world, and maybe start moving more and more toward kind of analog modes of expression. I'm not sure. I mean, because
Yeah.
I'm in that in between where I'm like, I love seeing what it's doing, and I love dabbling with it. For instance, like just before we started recording, I'd mentioned I run a D&D campaign online
Yeah. Yeah.
via Zoom with good friends of ours, but we all live in different places now. And COVID kind of set it up where when we moved just after COVID, not that we're out of COVID yet, but you know what I mean. We still wanted to keep playing D&D, but I'm like, all right, what if I start just running it on Zoom, but I'll use Blender as a way by which to set up like the game itself so we can play it that way. But then
Yeah.
also like just recently, I started to want to add a little bit more flavor to it as well. So I'm like, hey, you meet this NPC somewhere and this is what they look like. And I just do it through Mid-Journey. And I'm marveling at how good it is at coming up with interesting like fantasy illustrations. It's also
Right.
terrifying because I see it and I'm like, man, that's if the scene doesn't have those things that would immediately tell us that it's AI generated, such as like hands. Hands are still
Hmm.
many digits and they're all weird. But if in the
Right.
absence of stuff like that, like I'm looking for moments where I can immediately tell it's AI, and sometimes I can't.
Yeah.
Right. And it's fun because there's no consequence to this. It's just my friends are going to see these images, right? But it's allowing me to like peek into what it's doing, and it's cool because then it also in some ways can inspire me then to go back to Blender and like reimagine some of the things that I'm making for the game itself because of things that I wouldn't have thought of had it not been for this AI generated image telling me that it's
Right.
so I don't know. So right now I'm dabbling in it in the way of, again, consequence free, just goofy nerdy stuff for my
Yeah.
D&D campaign, but it allows me to just at an arm's length kind of see what implications it might have if it's scaled out of that into say the domain of influencing people's livelihood, because it's going to replace say like fantasy artists. It could very well be like there was even a thing somewhere recently how Wizards of the Coast, when they released like a D&D module, they got in a lot of heat for it because one of the artists had just for a crunch of time, but they had turned the AI for a few of the illustrations, like
Hmm.
in the style of what they were doing. So it was like, wait, it's still that artist style, but uh, there were sort of tells that wait, this is actually AI. So people are very aware of it. They're looking for it, and currently it's still in that weird one or the other place.
Yeah.
But I wonder
Yeah.
what's going to start to happen more and more when they merge somehow. Like people are going to be able to merge the two dialogues into still a human generated vision thing. I don't know, badly worded,
Yeah.
but
I
I
mean,
think you know what I mean.
no, yeah, like an interface for that. I mean, I follow some people on Twitter or or X or whatever it's called these days, and who are experimenting with workflows like that. Like there's this AI software called Krea AI that's basically like you could screen cap. Have you ever seen it before? You
I
basically
haven't
share your
no.
screen, yeah, and you write a text prompt, but then it is it let's just say you say like some apples, right? And you can actually have it point towards like a your Photoshop screen, and you can start drawing with colors and painting, and then it will output the AI version of that using this, the
Hmm.
same composition, and using, temporally, it's still like wacky because it'll change, 50,000 times, but
Sure.
the beginning of it is really interesting because you can generate stuff based off of your input and have more direct control with that, which I think that's really cool because then it's more about the artist's vision on
Sure.
that. And like my opinion to a lot of these types of things, when I first saw like, Wizards of the Coast using AI for like all these publishers using them, it's it's a business, right? And they're going to take that um, they're going to take that route because it's more cost
Yep.
effective to them. At least now it is,
Sure.
and we'll see later because of how expensive it is to actually run this type of stuff. It's being heavily subsidized, and we don't really realize it. Kind of like
Yep.
the internet was, and I think uh, but the way I look at it is like, oh, that could empower if, once the dust settles on like the legalities of it, what's copyright, who, the model is being trained on, like they're really great because they're trained on great artists, and it's like has really good taste because of those artists, um, but once that settles, I think I look at it as like, wow, I don't need, the arm of Wizards of the Coast, or let's just say like a big publisher. I could do it myself, and
Sure.
I'm more in that line, whereas like, oh, it gives a ton of power to like the author to actually, forge their own trail. And for people who are more kind of entrepreneurial, who are more like, this is my work, you know um this is who I am as an artist. I think that's great. It's like it gives them so much more power over um, their own visions.
Yeah.
So, I think you'll see an influx of a lot of people, a lot of movies, or a lot of video games, or a lot of comics. I mean, I think the only thing holding those together are the intellectual properties that are associated with
Yeah.
those things. But it might everything's been reused so often now, and recycled and repackaged that, maybe it will spur a renaissance of original
Yeah. Yeah. It could be.
ideas,
And
because it's not like people say, oh, there's no original ideas anymore, and that's not true. I mean, the people are there's plenty of originality. It's just, what makes money for certain venues is, trusted or established fan bases. So if
yeah.
that goes away, then you'll see a change. I mean, it's
Yeah.
happened before, so I don't see why it can't happen now. I mean, uh, you see it in any industry.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I was just thinking about like Marvel comics, right? Like their house style. I'm a big comic geek, so I remember just like, through the 50s, 60s, 70s, you just had, you had to draw like John Buscema or Gene Colan. There was always Jack Kirby who was doing his own thing, but like you had to draw like that. John
Yeah.
Romita, like everyone had to look like that because you had to keep it consistent. That was the thought. And then the 80s roll around, and then you have like Bill Sienkiewicz and like Frank Miller,
Yeah.
and all these artists doing like whatever they wanted. Mike Mignola, like this just explosion of individuality, um, that
Well,
that
even
happened. And
just as an aside in there too, like I love how the early Sandman comics had Dave McKean covers on them too. And Dave McKean's
yeah,
covers are like it's not comic book work. Like in a way, it's like it was so subversive. It was like
yeah,
photography, early Photoshop merging stuff, but in a way that he handled it so well that there were these illusions of uh, dreamlike scenes that were so at odds with what you'd expect a comic book cover to to it's supposed to look like this, right? It was like
Right.
completely something else. So I know just what you mean. It's like, yeah, with any art form, right? Like any sort of even niche area of the art world, it's always going through its own horizontal evolution, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's just interesting to live in an age where the great disruptor to all of them, maybe not even disruptor, but this whole new thing that came in because it can emulate all of those styles is all like AI component. There's an interesting example of it where there's a painter called Ton Wolf, and he's just had a show, or maybe it's still up at Richard Heller Gallery in LA,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
he keeps
I follow him on
posting.
Instagram. Yeah.
Yeah, and he keeps
Yeah.
posting. Most of what he posts is stuff he's making on Stable Diffusion, which I
Hmm.
haven't touched on. I don't quite know how it works at all, but I'm curious to see, like, from seeing Ton Wolf's work, I'm like, hey, that's interesting because whatever generative like AI model that it's using, it's actually looking at specifically his work, and it's
Right.
constantly making like I think it's node based or something, how you set up the thing that you're prompting it to create. But it's interesting how some painters who then they produce beautiful paintings from, like Ton Wolf's paintings are beautiful, but he's so not hiding the fact of where these images are coming from. It's this weird
Hmm.
dialogue, the man in the machine dialogue, where it's like
Right.
it's talking to this machine generated thing that's revealing something that is maybe to a large degree unexpected, but then the artist goes, that's now going to be the thing that is going to be my vision. You're telling it
Right.
what your vision is, and it's showing you something that you may not have expected, is the unexpected vision that formed from your own, right? It's this,
Right.
like, again, it's a weird dialogue. That's all it is.
And I think
So
I mean, you're a, your work is a really great example of that, in the sense that it's imaginative realism, right? And how to achieve that vision is, if you go into the decades back in the day, it was done different ways.
yep,
And I think it's the best time ever to be an artist, because you now have access to all of those workflows,
yep,
and then some,
yeah,
that are evolving. And so you've never, I remember seeing a tutorial that you had given on like Photoshop. It was basically like photo bashing kind of your elements together to, it was like a rooftop with a bird.
yep,
uh and I remember I was like, "What? You could do that?" And that makes total sense. Like, I don't have to have all these references up at the same
yeah,
time, and and it was like at the same time I was watching Dan DeSantos like do he had like a demo with like a book cover they had done for Irene Gallo, and like him like, "Oh, I just took, him having a model and taking different photos and then just splicing them together in Photoshop." And it's just like little things like that, just opens your eyes to like what's actually possible. So, what led you down to
yeah.
the now explore 3D? Because here's the thing that not many people know. So I'm getting really into 3D, and you're like one of the main factors as to why I did it. I remember when I was teaching at
Oh,
art
cool.
school, I sat in on a couple of your classes, and I was like, whoa, this is this is nuts,
Yeah,
like, and like, this is just Martin, like, he like all this, like, he had a whole forest bed of like mushrooms and stuff, and like, this is a result of him just coming walking around in the in the woods, like, I need to, so he gets, give me an excuse
yeah,
to go outside, with my cell phone. I was like, I'm
yeah,
in,
yeah,
but one thing I found with 3D is like, there's a set of excitement, you exploring all these workflows, and there's a thousand things that, thousand ways of doing the same thing, and you're going through all these things, and like, but then at the end of the day, it's your vision once you're past like the technicalities. But what got you into 3D? Because I think that's, as a painter, I think all painters should learn something like Blender,
mhm.
because of
Oh yeah,
just
yeah,
especially if you want to visualize stuff, because is transformative in how much control you have.
Yep. Yeah, I was just talking with a student of mine, because I have two classes I'm doing on Tuesdays. One is the imaginative realism, more painting focused workshop, and then the other one is the blender workshop. And in the painting workshop, we were talking about what one of my students wants to do a scene with horses, but doesn't understand the subject yet as well as he would like. So that's what prompted me then to, because he's also auditing my Blender course. So that prompted me just to kind of expand a little bit as to how I myself approached 3D from the angle of wanting to understand form fully. Because if it's one thing, if I'm drawing something from a two-dimensional image or even from life, but it's just a single instance of it, it's a different relationship I form with the subject than if I actually see it fully in 3D and just actually build out the whole thing, anatomy and everything included. So my catalyst for wanting to go toward 3D was I was sharing a studio with Nicola Verlato, the painter. He's in Rome. We were in Brooklyn together for 1 year. I was just sharing a studio space with him. And I remember he was dabbling with Maya back then. So Maya is a 3D program that's been around for a long time, but he was just kind of in a cursory way playing around with it, but enough that he was able to set up human figures, which is the main subject of a lot of his work. And just to get a light source, cast shadows, the three-dimensionality of the form, just as if though somebody sat down and made a clay sculpture, say on like a Lazy Susan, and was able to turn it around. So I remember seeing that and going like, wait, this should be part of my toolbox at some point. But back then I just didn't get into it yet in an active sense, but it stayed there. I remember always being like, oh yeah, Nicola, like he uses it in such a way that then when it comes to translating that stuff onto a painted surface, I totally get the translation now. Like, I get how also in a multi-figure scenario, just to get the interaction between different figures in a very dynamic way. Because a lot of Nicola's paintings, they're so like action based that they're floating figures and they're figures in action poses, but they don't feel staged in any way. They feel like they really do belong the way that he's painted them. And I know a lot of that is owing to his understanding of the 3D aspect of these figures. Right? So what I ended up then doing is, this was prior to, just before COVID lockdowns happened, but definitely during the lockdowns, I went down a stupendously deep rabbit hole of just really taking it apart. But I went to Blender because Blender is free and it's open source, which I quite like. It has this it kind of has I would say a kind of spirit about it that reminds me of what the internet in its more optimistic years was all about, which was like, let's share, let's do this thing together, you know? So Blender's interesting in that it's always kind of, because it's sort of user fed in a way, in being open source. It's constantly being developed, but with a keen eye on what the other 3D creation suites are doing. So for instance, there's sculpting suite. So inside of Blender, you can do the entire thing. You can do animation, or you can do all the stuff to do with actually setting up your scenes. You can do hard surface modeling, what it's called, but you can also do sculpting in it. But sculpting is in Blender is closely looking at the industry standard program called ZBrush. And it's actually been porting over a lot of the functionality of ZBrush, which I've also now learned just to understand, like, well, why is ZBrush still like at the top of that heap? And so in getting into Blender and like really just going through tons of tutorials and just a lot of little projects where I'm just trying to figure it out. What has become revealed to me there, as I said, is like my quest into Blender was really just about starting to become more creatively involved with my reference material, because I do need it for the kind of scenes that I'm setting up. I'm not just painting these out of my head. I wish I had that kind of brain function that I could do that, but it is very helpful to me to create color studies, right? They used to be, I did them in Photoshop, and then I'd paint over them and just like harmonize all the things, palette and stuff like that there. But having moved that now also into the 3D space, it just brings in a ton of extra components that really let me like just tune in really closely to what it is that I'm creating. So I can create the scenes themselves, but also the subjects inside of them. I've created as, it's, you know, in video game terms, it's like often called a T-pose if you're dealing with a figure, because then you can put an armature on it and pose the figure to whatever you want. I do the same with my animal figures, right? I'll create them fully, texture them, but then from that static pose, I can just do whatever I want to with them, right? And what's interesting about that too is, again, largely it's almost like learning something like Blender, learning something like ZBrush. It's almost like doing a life drawing / life sculpting course, where that's really, I'm learning so much just from making, say, a horse, or making a feline that can turn a tiger or lion or whatever I want. Just understanding the anatomy, like, but in such a way that I'm then able to visualize, like, hey, if I take this existing anatomy and I've understood it well when I first make the model, now when I start to pose it too, it really is naturalistic in the way that it functions. And coupled with the fact that then I can put any type of light sources in there I want, internal light sources, external ones, full environmental influence. What you use in Blender often is what's called environment textures, or HDRIs. And all they are is 360, full 360 sets of photographs that have been stitched together to create a kind of a sphere that's existing around everything. And by virtue of using something like that too, you can set up any kind of like ambient environment you want, because what Blender will do is also calculate correctly all the bounce lights, reflected lights, environmental effects, all that kind of stuff. So largely it's due to the influence of just being in the space with somebody who was a great influence on me as a painter as well. But you know, having Nicola kind of catalytically set that in my mind, that just sat there for a while. And then also it's from watching movies, playing video games, where like I've always wanted to understand how the hell are they doing this stuff. There's also that, like as goofy as it is to admit to playing video games, that I'm 43, but still there's something so interesting from artist perspective, especially in the era we're in now, where it used to be, you know, when I was a kid, like video games were pretty rudimentary, but still impressive. They're still like, even in like pixel art back in the day when it was just two-dimensional, it was still, there's something there that also had a great influence in me wanting to be a painter, because, you know, just making interactive, immersive kind of spaces that are visually compelling. There was something there, but in the meantime, where those domains have gone to, right? Like later generation games, say, like a good example would be like The Last of Us.
Mm-hmm.
So Last of Us, the first game and the second one, that then I actually hilariously feel like, though I like the HBO series that came from them, the games are still, it's so weird to say this about a video game, but storytelling wise and like voice acting wise and how they've cinematically set them up, I still feel like they're superior. It's weird to say that. It's normally, you know, like, oh, the book was better than the movie that came from it. It's funny for me to say like the video game is still better, you know, but playing The Last of Us, this is just one example of many of them, but in The Last of Us 2, there's what they use a lot in it is what's called photogrammetry, where you can 3D scan. You 3D scan actual things and then turn them into 3D objects. And a friend of mine works at Naughty Dog in the photogrammetry department, and he was saying like, yeah, like a lot of the what you call assets, like the things you see in the game, actually exist as real things that are then been like doctored a little bit afterward, so as to make them able to be in the game. But that too, like 3D scanning certain things in the environment, it's just changed completely how I go about sourcing out my reference. Because it used to be I'd go out, take single shots of stuff, Photoshop, stitch stuff together, whatever. But
Right.
nowadays, with understanding what I can do inside Blender, I'm also at times compelled to just like get a full 3D scan. Say at the Metropolitan Museum, last time I was there in December, I spent like 4 hours just going around 3D scanning all the sculptures that I saw, and now have them as 3D objects that I can place in scenes or sculpt back into or texture however I want. And there's something there that because of the technology being there, I'm just, it's this kind of weird wonderland that has opened up for me as somebody who isn't just a painter painting paintings, but also someone who's like hunting and gathering for the things that make up my
Right.
paintings. So it just makes my field research, my reference gathering is just, it's fun. It's super rewarding to go out and take even a single image of something and then project it onto a 3D model that I make of the thing. So you had mentioned like sitting in on one of my or a couple of my Blender classes, and for instance, like creating a field of grass and mushrooms and just the setting to place maybe another subject inside of it and then turn it into a painting from that. A lot of that's derived too from two-dimensional photographs that I turn into what are called texture sets that then I can just make the model, but project that photograph directly onto it, and it looks exactly like the real thing. Because again, a Blender's render engine just taking into account all the interesting stuff, such as even like just super cool stuff like subsurface scattering, which is the effect of light going into a semi-transparent surface and like glowing as a result of the light hitting it. It's just so fun to discover that once one knows how to use that kind of technology, it makes the searching and the making of reference material so fun and rewarding, and just it feels like magic in a way, right? So anyway, I'm such a big fan of that. And again, I will say to any purists out there who are like, oh man, that's like a cheat code. Well, it's not, guys. You're making it. It's just, again, artists of old would have wanted to use it, but they had clay to use to make mock-ups. They had, they set up mannequins that had the robes and dresses on or whatever.
Lay figures, man.
They would have used this. Yeah. So anyway, it's a long ramble about how I discovered ended up landing there, but I'm excited to see where it goes too, because as I said, Blender is constantly kind of growing, and each new sort of version that they put out, it just more and more complex things are being added to it, and it's also very user friendly if you can get past the learning curve. But it's like with any program, that what is it, you need to learn about 15% to do 85% of the work in it. So if somebody opens up Blender at first, they're like, this is too much. Well, there's maybe 85% of the content in Blender that I never care about even learning yet, I guess, because my purpose for why I'm using it is pretty specific. I'm not animating it or whatever. But also one other thing I should mention about having started to dabble in 3D is that I'm also learning or discovering the implications it might have for what my art could do beyond just painting too. So I've just started to learn 3D printing as well. So I got a large format. It's not huge, but a large format 3D or a resin printer. And that too, there's this really strange kind of almost like mystical feeling about having made something totally virtually, but then seeing it emerge as a physical object. So even there too, if somebody learns something like Blender and then just simply 3D prints it, well, then you have a physical object you can set up in your studio and learn all of the form about it as a tangible object. But yeah, I'm gonna see how this starts to extend more and more into also my forays into sculpting, like actually haptically sculpting. But I started digitally. There's a friend of mine here in Savannah who has a CNC machine, so you could technically mill out something out of like insulation foam, that like dense foam. I just saw him do a project like that recently. It's like 8 feet tall.
Oh my
so
God. Wow.
I could see that happening. And then, just a random aside here, but in that, mentorship program I did out in Spain with a few other instructors. We all met with the students one on one throughout the
That
week.
was Menorca Pulsar, right? If I'm mistaken.
Yep.
Yeah.
The yeah, quarantine is the name in Menorca, and it was so interesting because I had one student. We all get a sheet from them before they meet up with us, just to they give you a brief overview of who they are and what they're working on, whatever. And one of my students was a co-founder of ZBrush.
Oh
So
my
as
God.
he came, so we ended up talking a bunch about like how might he work with what he's very good at, which is ZBrush, but started translating it into 2D. And meanwhile, I'm like, how do I take my 2D stuff but become better at 3D? Like, it was really cool. And then he posted later that because of the mentorship in Spain, he was compelled to actually start to see his ZBrush stuff become real. So he actually had he contacted a place that uses stone. They use, I don't know if it's a CNC machine, but same kind of idea, where it's milling out from a block of marble or granite. It
Wow.
mills out a 3D image. So he ended up with a large, like full life-size sculpture that he'd made in ZBrush in stone, and that type of
Unbelievable.
stuff. It's very interesting to me. I just have to see if budgets allow for me to go that route, but that's definitely a
Right.
way by which I can see sculpting starting to become a nice translation of what I'm doing in the digital space into the like haptic analog space. So it's cool.
Right. Right.
We'll see what
Yeah.
happens.
It's
Yeah.
well, I think that's like you're constantly you strike me as a really curious person who's constantly looking for new challenges or just new ways of doing things. And
Yep.
it's like, oh, what if I could do this, what if I could do that, and I think that's something that's really admirable, because you're not married to any medium or
Yep.
subject matter or just sort of way of displaying your artwork. And I feel the same exact way. I know people always ask me, like, I get asked, are you gonna, what do you see yourself 10 years or 5 years? I'm like, well, I might be painting, I might not be. I might be designing
Yeah. Yeah.
furniture. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, it's like if it fits my vision, then, or like what I want to make, and get me out of bed every morning, then that's what I'm going to be doing.
Yep.
But I think as a painter, in terms of just like longevity, I just think that, like, if I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life or foreseeable future, I got to be trying new things, right? It's like, I mean, I know there are painters that end up, getting into these like super high end blue chip galleries and then end up basically painting the same painting over and over again. And
Sure. Yeah.
it's like, well, they might be financially set, and hey, that's awesome, to be able to just do that and support yourself, um, at that high level. But at the same time, it's like there's got to be a point in time where you kind of regress, and that scares the hell out of me. Like, I never want to regress as an artist, because
Yeah. Yeah.
I've seen it happen, and it's like, wow, that's really scary. And new technology like this, like, I don't really like video games, which is why I'm wearing a PlayStation shirt, as you could probably see. No, I'm a huge video game fan. Just joking. Yeah. So, like, when you were saying Last of Us, I'm like, hell yeah, man, I know that. Yeah, yeah. So, like, yeah, I just seeing like what they, like, artists like that work in um that realm is just, I mean, they're unbelievable. I mean, you set me down, like, you're, so I credit you, and like a good friend of mine's Urban Rodriguez, who's character concept art. He's a painter too. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he worked at Naughty Dog on the Last of Us remastered. So he did all the
Oh,
new sort
nice.
of
Cool.
skins at the second one. And so uh him and he like exposed me to all these different artists, and I'm thinking, like, oh my god, look at all these skills, like people like, Raman Jandot and like Piotr Krinsky, and like all these studios, and like just a high end type of imagery that they're making, like Eitan Zana, like all these artists that could be like incredible fine artists. if they wanted to. It's just their
Yeah.
ability to kind of, create imagery. And it's like you were saying before, it's like, oh, I want to know how they did that. Like that is intriguing to me because, I might paint scenes of like around where I live and or still lives that, in my home. But what if I 3D scanned them, or like,
Yeah.
and that's what I've been doing. I've just been 3D scanning things, with my phone all over the place. And then I'm like looking at drones and I'm like, oh boy, look at this stuff. I can
Yeah. Yeah.
3D scan the whole thing. I can make an entire solo show on a single 3D scan run,
Sure.
that could be cool, and so, or not being limited to, I think the cool thing about that type of technology is that you're not limited to the information that you have access to necessarily. So it's like
Yep.
before photographs, it was like, well, I could only make paintings if I need to visualize something. I could kind of make it based off of what I can get.
Yeah.
uh and so, it's like, look at Rembrandt. He went broke buying all these like crazy things for his paintings, like armor and like, all these like expensive clothes for the stuff he wanted to do. And um but now it's like, okay, I could just take a photo of it. That's great. And now it's even more so. It's like I don't have to be limited by the direction of the light source that I'm
Yeah.
getting. Like, so it's like,
Yeah.
what if I wanted underlit, or side view, or 3 lights on it, or 6 lights, or so on and so forth. So I think, it's really exciting to see a painter like, like yourself, embrace that type of stuff, because it's not like, the thing about your work is it's never changed, in the sense of like, I know it's still you. It's the same voice going through. It's just constantly evolving, and you're able to do, you're constantly pushing to like yourself in terms of the how epic the imagery, how intricate the imagery can get, especially with like color contrasts, and you push, compositions. I mean, and just the size and like subject matter and color. I mean, like, I think that like you being able to do like something like this right here, and then at the same time, you have a painting with, for those of you listening to this, it's like a painting with a bull, next to a tree with a wreath of flowers around them. And oops, paintings like that have, multiple figures, that with almost like these really high chroma colors, with intricate lighting. I mean, that's, to be able to do that and be like, oh, like, okay, yeah, that's what I want to do. This is my vision. That's exciting for me. It's like, oh, yeah, that's what I want as an artist is, we want kind of more creative freedom to be able to access those things and
Yeah.
to be able to do that. I mean, one last thing I'll talk about, like in terms of like work processes, when you were talking about the horse, where you had a student with the horse, I'm like always talking about 3D, like learn 3D. Like if you want a horse, like you could sculpt it, or you can get a Sketchfab model and study
Yeah.
that. And like, you could do all these crazy things with it. I was like, I always tell a story about Ernest Meissonier. Do you know his work?
I don't.
Um, he did the famous painting of Napoleon and the Met with like all of the horses. The
Oh
horse
yeah.
riders was like a
Yeah. Yeah.
huge,
Sure.
yeah.
Sure. Yep.
And so James Gurney had a blog post about how he studied horses, and he was a big time, like he would sculpt a lot of stuff and then paint from that. And there's like examples of it, but like to study the gallop of the horse, he was very successful for his time. During his time, he was like the number one guy, but he said that he figured out the way somebody asked him like, how do you get the gallop? And he says, well, I built a scaffolding. I had my assistants build a scaffolding system with a train track on my grounds, and had a horse and rider with full armor there. And I figured out that if I could have my assistants push, and push my easel, like on top of it had an easel with where he could draw from. If he had his assistants and push the track, the easel down, and the horse gallop, he can actually study the gallop, like properly, and he would have it reset.
That's
I said,
crazy.
so you could either do that, because that
Right.
sounds good, or you can go to Sketchfab and maybe grab a model of a horse. So it's just like
Yeah, one or the other works. I would say one
Right, right.
is
It's
less painful of a way to get
right. So,
there.
but
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a great point on it, because it's, artists forever have wanted to get to the bottom of whatever they're doing, like the understanding, again, like the subject, how to actually translate that into the immersive and resonant image that results from it in the form of the painting. But there are no like shortcuts to it, really. Like you've got to figure it out. But in the past, you'd had to figure it out by ingenious means. I mean, that's ingenious, but also like the footprint of that is crazy. You have to build
right.
all that. You have to have a huge operation, like it sounds almost like something they'd set up for a film with like a big effect about to happen. But
Exactly.
meanwhile, in the day and age we're in now, all you do require is really just a computer that's just able to handle some of the Blender, and then the hours put into understanding what you're doing inside of that. But even like even not going super deep into the program, as you said, you can with Blender, you can download models that you found somewhere. That alone, you required then to build something. You simply need to port it in, and then you can orbit around and pan around and all that. And sure, that's a quick and dirty way to get there, but the again, the footprint of what that is not great. That's what I like about it too, is that in setting up reference this way, I'm not getting a lot of extra stuff and like material and whatever. Of course,
Right.
it's like it's just yeah. It used to be that I'd have to acquire some things for that kind of purpose, but nothing as elaborate as having a scaffolding on train tracks kind of a thing. But
Right.
just to have it here in the inside of my studio, I can build all of those worlds just within this program. It just, yeah, it mitigates having like this huge production with a lot of extra material, because I also feel like material waste is a big reason why I'm painting the images that I'm painting, is kind of to talk
Right.
about that too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And
yeah,
and that's a great segue, because you're behind behind you. You have all these paintings that you're working on, and you're working on a solo show, right? For Gallery Polson.
yep.
Um, and so when is that?
It's going to be November this year, so 2024. November. It's at the end of November, like right at the switch between November and December. I want to say it's November 30th is when it's opening. So it's not for a while, but yeah. So I have some time to still produce a series, but the series is well underway. I have a good half of it not completed, but well underway to getting there. Um, yeah.
That's awesome. That's so awesome. Yeah. So, and then links to the gallery and Martin's page will be in the video description too. And so, um, I guess that's a perfect spot to kind of uh, talk about kind of other things you're working on. I mean, I know like on your website you have a store with where you can get prints and as well as a beautiful art book. I saw a flip. I think I don't know where I saw a physical copy of it, but I saw it was gorgeous. It might have been
Thanks.
actually um, in New York for some reason. I don't know what it was, but
Okay.
uh, yeah, awesome stuff. And you and I talked about you might be having some other things available, right, for your store.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm about to release, I think, two prints. One is going to be a super limited edition where I do hand embellished versions. I think I'm just gonna. I haven't quite figured out exactly the number, but I think I'm only doing 10 of those total. And then I'm gonna have one larger run of 50 or 100 kind of limited edition. Those are coming up very soon. I think probably within the next, from the time we're recording this, about 2 weeks from now, I'm going to have them ready to ship. Um, and then I'm also starting to work on the next book. So that last book, Babel, came out in 2014, I want to say. So it's been a decade. So I feel like it's nice sort of next chapter to encapsulate into a book is happening right now. I'm just
Awesome.
through the logistics of what we're doing there, but it is happening. I just don't know at all yet when it's going to be published, but it's underway.
All
So
right, can't wait to
yeah.
grab a copy, man.
Cool.
And then we talked about your Blender mentorship. That's through Smart School
Yep.
right here. So it's a fantastic course. So I'd definitely go check it out if you're interested in that. And as well as your Magic of Realism course,
Yep.
which you didn't have at the time when I was there, but something I would definitely love to sit in on and learn. So it's super awesome that
Thanks. Thanks.
you're sharing all that information. And then this is your Instagram. You're on. I know you're on Instagram at Martin Wittfooth. So do check that out as well. So did you have anything else upcoming?
No,
To be.
that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
I have 3 shows booked back to back, 3 years apart.
Oh,
So
that's it, man. Oh
yeah,
no.
that's it.
Okay.
That's it. I'm slacking in my old age, but yeah. So it's kind of early to announce, but I'll have a large solo show at Corey Helfer Gallery in 2025. It's in that
Nice.
big space. I think it's like 5,000 square feet or something. So I have
Wow.
I have plenty of work in front of me to even fill that space, but then I'll be returning to New York for my 2026 show at Harmon Projects, Hashimoto Contemporary, that space. So yeah, those are some ways away, but this is just to say that I kind of have my next 3 years in lockdown right now, which is really like sometimes that's the kind of boost that I need to really get after it in the studio.
Right.
So it's a nice way to set it up where each year I just have this sort of just a flow through one series into the next, and should be cool to see what happens there. Just because as I'm painting even this show for Polson, ideas are now starting to form for the next show that's almost in dialogue with the one I'm doing now, but still wants to have its own sort of spirit around it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I like where my mind's at now with this work, where there's no room or excuses for any creative block. I'm just pushing through one piece after another. So yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. That's awesome. And well, I guess that's a perfect place to end. We'll let you get back to painting because it
Cool.
sounds like you got a couple of pieces on these to
Yeah,
do.
yeah, a couple, yeah.
But yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
But
Well,
Ray, I really
thank.
appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun. Great to chat with you, and thanks for having me.
Oh no, my pleasure, Martin. And those of you if you watch this on YouTube, if you consider liking and subscribing, that'd be awesome. You get the bell notification to see and when we have a new episode, and you can check out all of our pre-recorded or previous episodes on our YouTube page. And outside of that, uh, that's it. So thanks, Martin. Good luck with
Cool.
everything, man.
Thanks, Ray.
Good chatting
Thanks.
with you.
All right.
All
Talk
right.
soon. Bye.
Bye bye.